Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this overview of the Positive Impact Report for the Animals at Home Network. I am Lori, and I'm speaking to you tonight from Spirit Keeper Animal Sanctuary. I'm the Director of Behavioral Husbandry here, and this presentation and the report is on behalf of Unity Environmental University. If you're not familiar with what Animals at Home is, it originally started as a single podcast, and its founder, Dylan Perrin, pictured here on the right, wanted to explore the ethics of captive animal management through the lens of biological science, conservation, and human nature. He started this 6 years ago, and now this is where we're at. We have a whole network called the Animals at Home Network, and they're dedicating to educating people and having conversations about practicing ethical herpetoculture. The Animals at Home Network is something that I researched heavily for this report. I looked at their metrics, I looked at their analytics, I interviewed its founder, Dylan Perrin, I interviewed some of its audience, and I interviewed some of the stakeholders involved in partnerships with the Animals at Home Network. And I came to the conclusion that they are driving change within herpetoculture, and they're doing that in a positive direction. So the purpose of this report and its scope is really to provide an overview of what the Animals at Home Network is and what their mission is, to evaluate the organization's journey so far, to assess the real-world impact that it's had, and to look at its future. And so hopefully this video presentation is going to give the audience, any academics that are interested, and any collaborators that are interested, an idea of what is in the report, as well as a history of the organization, some of the successes the organization has had, and then a general assessment of the organization's status. So right now we're going to take a look at how the Animals at Home Network and their work within herpetoculture has made and continues to make a significant impact as a driver for positive change. We're going to do this using a theory of change framework. And what that means is we're going to go through some visions that the organization has had, their mission statement, and then we're going to move on from there to inputs and outputs, and I'll explain that. So Dylan shared with me in a personal interview that his vision for the Animals at Home podcast originally and later the network was to promote animal welfare and ethical practices and conservation efforts within herpetoculture, within the community of reptile and amphibian keepers through education, collaboration, and advocacy. And that its mission is to engage and support the herpetoculture community by providing educational resources, fostering collaborations, and promoting sustainable practices for the care of reptiles and amphibians. Now, the vision and the mission statement are making some assumptions here, and I'm going to put those in context. The organization believes that by them educating and empowering reptile and amphibian keepers, that these keepers can then in turn improve their understanding and practices as they take care of their animals, and that this is going to lead to better animal welfare and more of a connection in general with conservation. So this required some inputs. You've got a podcast platform, but you have to put work into it. And that includes expertise in herpetoculture, making partnerships with organizations like Custom Reptile Habitats and the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy. And then you're going to need financial resources, which Animals at Home currently gains from merchandise sales, donations, and its Patreon platform. So some of the activities and strategies that Dylan and then later the whole network has used to make this happen are by hosting educational podcasts with experts in herpetoculture, collaborating with organizations and individuals, both within herpetoculture and without herpetoculture. Meaning these people are maybe herpetoculture adjacent. They may be artists or exhibit designers or habitat designers, or they might design enrichment. And maybe they do that for all sorts of species, but Dylan has interviewed them about how they can apply their work to reptiles and amphibians. They also make quarterly donations to support conservation efforts, and they promote sustainable practices and ethical considerations when it comes to reptile and amphibian care. So all of this has resulted in some immediate results or some outputs by the organization. And that includes their podcast episodes. They put out podcast episodes with valuable insights and information, and they form collaborative initiatives and partnerships. And then they make donations to conservation organizations. So all of their efforts also result in some intermediate outcomes or some middle of the road results that are a little bit more long-term, like increasing the general knowledge and awareness in the herpetoculture community about more ethical keeping practices and about more evidence-based practices. The adoption of sustainable and ethical practices in reptile and amphibian care is something that starts to filter out throughout herpetoculture the longer that the podcast is going on and the more the network grows. And then a positive impact on animal welfare and conservation efforts in general. Then we want to look at impacts that are ultimate outcomes, long-term outcomes that the podcast and the network have had and continue to have and hope to have into the future. And those include enhanced well-being and welfare of reptiles and amphibians in captivity as a whole, contributions to conservation and preservation of reptile and amphibian species in their natural habitats as well. And then just to have a general positive influence on the public's understanding and engagement within herpetoculture and within conservation. So how do we measure this? What are the indicators that Animals at Home has been successful and is likely to sustain that success in the future? Well, we can look at podcast download numbers and listenership statistics. We can look at YouTube and how many people have viewed the videos. We can get feedback and testimonials from people within herpetoculture. So we can interview academics. We can interview people that work in the industry, like manufacturers of enclosures and enrichment items. And we can interview the audience, the listeners, the people that watch the videos. And so impact assessments and evaluations then are something that should be conducted periodically so that the organization can make sure that they are staying on track. And I'm doing that here with this positive impact report. So the positive impact report is going to include several sections. The first part is going to be an executive summary. So if you just want to quickly peruse the main points of the report, that's what you should read, the executive summary. It's going to outline key findings and highlights, including successful podcast episodes, those that have included personal interviews, expert panels, and roundtables, those that have had the most downloads. Successful collaborations with organizations like the ARC, which showcase the network's commitment to conservation. It's going to show the growth from a single podcast to a network of podcasts that now reaches over 20,000 subscribers. And then the summary is going to have examples of impact metrics. These are the things we can measure and the outcomes that Animals at Home has achieved. And just some examples I'll give you real quick are that the cohabitation roundtable has had over 72,000 views, 140 comments, and 438 likes. And the Choosing the Right Reptile Roundtable has had over 14,000 views, 89 comments, and 189 likes. This is on YouTube, and this shows that people are engaging with this content, care enough about this content, not only to watch it, but also to comment about it and have conversations about the topics. Dylan and his network have raised over $2,000 that they've donated to the ARC. And the audience of the network has grown on YouTube alone from 6,000 subscribers just a few years ago to over 20,000 subscribers today. The report has a section entitled Goals and Objectives. And the primary goal of the organization is to promote ethical and progressive practices within herpetoculture. And these goals align with a broader scope, which includes conservation initiatives by raising awareness about conservation and supporting organizations like the ARC. And then the objectives include educating the audience about responsible reptile keeping, fostering community engagement with its audience and with its collaborators and stakeholders, and then supporting conservation efforts. And all of this shows that the network has a focus on responsible reptile keeping and welfare. And this contributes to a broader initiative and advocates for ethical care practices, and most importantly, dispels myths about reptile keeping, and pushes people into a more evidence-based approach to keeping reptiles and amphibians under captive management. There's a section on audience and impact, and it's actually quite a long section. I'm just going to briefly tell you that some traditional demographics that YouTube provided in their analytics include an age range for the audience of 18 to 54 years old, and a gender split of male to female, 65 to 35. And then locations where people are listening include 55% of listeners in the United States, 15% total from Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. And then the remaining 30% of listeners are listening from countries all over the world, encompassing the rest of the planet. So there are real world impacts that not only the original podcast, Animals at Home, has had and is having, but that the whole network is having. And I want to exemplify that here with some remarks from someone I interviewed who's an audience member that I'm just going to call here ZS, but there's a longer interview with him in the report. And this individual made the move from keeping reptiles in racks to keeping reptiles in naturalistic habitats. And he credits the Animals at Home podcast for opening his eyes to a better way and giving him the information and resources he needed to progress his reptile care. And these are in his own words. So the report is going to contain lots of activities and initiatives that the Animals at Home network has done, has initiated and participated in and made happen. And these are highlighted through storyboards. And each storyboard is going to tell you who the players are, what the problem is, what obstacles had to be overcome, the meaningful activities that Animals at Home engaged in, and then the outcomes and highlights that are a result of these. Just a few examples of these storyboards that you'll be able to see in the report are the roundtables on choosing a reptile and cohabiting reptiles. One of the storyboards is about how the Animals at Home podcast created an entire network of podcasts in order to sustain growth, about their rainforest conservation efforts. And then there's a storyboard, I had to include this, about hermit crab welfare, because not only does this show the Animals at Home network is expanding beyond herpetoculture and into overall animal keeping and the ethics of keeping multiple species under human care, but it highlights a lesser known species, hermit crabs. And there have been a couple of episodes about hermit crabs, and one of them is the most downloaded episode ever on the entire network. All of this great stuff didn't happen without challenges. And along the way, Dylan and the network have learned some lessons. So those challenges, especially initially, included financial limitations, time constraints, and scarce resources. When you're a single person starting an individual podcast, that's not that hard to do, but you've got to have finances in order to pay for internet service, in order to pay for Zoom service to conduct interviews, in order to pay for podcasting equipment and computers and cameras, and if necessary, people to edit your show. And Dylan had to overcome and still has to overcome time constraints. He has a full-time job in addition to the podcast. He has a family. So he has limited time to dedicate to this. And resources in general are just scarce, like people to help edit, like people to come on the show and be interviewed, like people to do your social media for you and help answer questions and just help support the whole organization. Those kinds of resources are scarce. So strategies to overcome these challenges that have been working out and will continue to hopefully work out in the future are merchandise sales of sweaters and t-shirts, sweatshirts, Patreon memberships once the Patreon platform was established, and then just implementing the network as a whole has been an effective strategy, because now instead of one host and one podcast, there are multiple podcasts with multiple hosts. So the work can be spread around and it's not going to take such a drain of one person's time. So lessons learned from all this, from this great journey that Animals at Home has been going through, is financial planning is important, effective time management is important, and it's super important to seek help. Seeking community support through collaborations, through volunteerism, and through patronage is important. The collaborations and partnerships have been an integral part of growing the network and also spreading the word and spreading the message of ethical keeping and progressing care. So a few of the network's partners include the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy, custom reptile habitats, and exotic enrichment. And they are all detailed in the report. So if you want to read more about that, please grab a copy of the report. The impact of these collaborations includes donations for conservation, a broader reach, more ways to spread the message. In other words, two-way advertising. So Animals at Home Network is now being advertised through custom reptile habitats, through exotic enrichment, through other partners, through the ARC. And in turn, the podcast is able to advertise for these other organizations. And then some of these things mean also financial benefits, because merchandise sales is going to help financially. And then a small percentage of sales of exotic enrichments, enrichment items, and custom reptile habitats and closures goes back to the podcast and to the network so they can continue doing their job. So what are the plans for the future, and how is the network going to sustain? Well, the future includes continuation of the podcast and continuation of the YouTube videos. That is the staple of this network. That's the main thing that they output to the public. Dylan has committed, verbally at least, in personal communication, to at least 100 more podcast episodes of the Animals at Home podcast. That doesn't include the additional podcasts that are part of the network with those additional hosts. And then to increase donations for conservation. And that is going to come in turn from increased merchandise sales and increased money that the network makes as a whole. That just means more money is going to be increased that they can donate to conservation. So sustainability and growth is going to happen by maintaining and building the network. So keeping the podcasts going that are already there and hopefully adding more in the future. Maintaining and growing the social media presence. So maintaining their presence on YouTube, on podcasting platforms, on Instagram, on Facebook, and on Patreon, and then growing those as much as possible into the future. And then to build financial sustainability for this network, we're looking at what merchandise can be sold in addition to t-shirts and sweaters. What business partnerships can the network connect with in the future above what they already have, and how can the Patreon platform be grown? So in summary, the written report is very detailed. It's close to 50 pages long. It has specific examples of these things that I mentioned. It contains storyboards and infographics. Like this infographic to the right is one that's included in the report, and it is just a huge shout out to some of the significant things the network has done, like since 2018, raised $2,000 for conservation, grown a global audience, had over 300 episodes and still counting, almost 3 million show listens, and almost 4 million, or about 3.5 million video views, 385 total uploads to the network, 21,000 YouTube subscribers, over 2,000 Facebook followers, and 8,000 Instagram followers. So that's significant reach, and that reach needs to continue to grow. The report is also going to include personal stories from people that I interviewed that are listeners and collaborators, and then it's going to have ample references and resources. The sections in the report include the executive summary, goals and objectives, the audience and impacts that the network has had on those audience members, activities and highlights from throughout the years, and then a breakdown of the metrics and measurements. Each one of these sections is going to include subsections as well. So I thank you very much for listening and engaging with me. I encourage you to ask me for a copy of the report, to check out some of these resources. These are just references, page 1, and these are additional references, page 2. So I'm happy now to answer any questions that you have.
Whoa.
Do you have any questions, Stephanie, or were you just being polite and listening?
Not really question, but I didn't know that it was so big. Yes.
It's really, really grown over the years. And thank you for joining me from Belgium. Is
Yes,
it the
it's
middle
4
of the
o'clock.
night there for you,
Yes.
or is it during the day?
No, it's 4 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, well, you're always so dedicated when I present, and I know that you listen to Dylan's podcast too, and so I really appreciate you joining me from Europe.
Yes, of course.